Well, today I have a particularly interesting speaker to join with us to recount some of his experience and also insights into really the corporate property world and property investment world. We have Mark Wist. Mark is a corporate property investment strategy and advisor with 35 years of experience in listed and unlisted property trusts and funds management, property valuation, research, asset allocation, advisory, investment performance analysis and benchmarking, property acquisitions, really sort of covering quite a wide range, especially with what I would call the top end of property. And so particularly interesting history. Mark's also been involved quite actively in education and communicating his experience in the corporate world back into newcomers. He has over 30 postgraduate modules that he's written in property markets and property development, and has lectured at universities and conferences both in Australasia and Europe. He's engaged as an independent expert witness in the Federal Court, the Supreme Courts of New South Wales and Queensland, and the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And he now operates his own investment advisory practice, consulting to funds managers, institutional investors, family investors, high net worth investors, developers and corporates. He acts as an independent responsible manager on a couple of Australian financial services licenses and a number of investment committees. So thank you for joining us, Mark, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation this morning and your insights, both in terms of the practical technical side of how property works and where it's going and so on, but also on what I would think of as almost like the politics of operating as a property economist, property valuer and funds manager. So what I might do is just let it go over to you now to maybe start off by saying a little bit about where you see the situation in property and say funds management at present, with some of the maybe recent influences that have really prompted us to shake ourselves out of our complacency. And we might talk about a number of things from the impacts of inflation to the dreaded COVID and so on. Welcome.
Thanks, Garrick, and thanks for the intro, and thanks for the opportunity to address your students. Yeah, look, it has been a particularly significant period of time over the last, 6 months and 2 years for different reasons. You mentioned a couple of the really big ones, that is inflation and COVID. And so maybe I'll kick off with those and just some thoughts on those. In terms of COVID, setting aside the tragic loss of life and taking an apolitical approach to it, just purely a pragmatic approach, what it seems to me is that it has effectively rewritten the rule book on property, and more particularly the relationship between people and property. So I'm a firm believer that property is fundamentally about people. If you had to boil it down to one word, whether you're talking about the utility value of a house, which serves its function as somewhere to live, and Maslow's primary need for shelter, right through to the extruded investment value of a shopping centre, an office building, or whatever. It serves a number of functions, but all of those functions rely on the usage of people. And when you take away people from that scenario, you have an entirely different product, an entirely different approach to how conceptually you might think about value and valuation. And so I think it fundamentally changed the underlying precept of what we understand property to be. both philosophically and for more importantly for your students, probably practically. And a practical example of that might be that, among the things I do is some performance analytics for some of the super funds in Australia. And they have big portfolios, as you can imagine, in the billions, across hundreds and hundreds of pretty significant assets, household name type assets. And the flow through that we saw through the performance of those assets was it was, well, entirely unexpected, and seismic would be understating it. So we had assets that were generating maybe $10 million a quarter in net operating income that suddenly plunged down to, like $250,000 in a quarter, because of rent relief in particular. And so when you start doing that and you roll that out over 6-9 months, say 3 quarters, and that has its obvious flow through to net operating income, which is the element that gets capitalized for valuation. You either have to revalue it with on a basis of severely reduced income, or take some kind of philosophical synthetic view to what the value should be, rather than what the value actually is on pure valuation principles. And so a value of say $1 billion or whatever might suddenly, for a period of time, be worth 100 million or 50 million, which if you step back and sort of take the second derivative of that, that would trigger just about every covenant you could possibly imagine, particularly if it had debt on it, right? Your interest coverage ratio and your loan covenant ratios would be blown out of the water. And so there needs to be, and there was, a more pragmatic, sensible solution to it, which basically just walked and stepped around valuation principles completely, and smoothed out those values in order to not trigger anything. And it was in valuation land, an exercise in sort of synthetic overlay that kind of ignored and looked through the impact of COVID, the actual practical impact of COVID, and to a more sort of sensible position. The outcome of that, most assets are now largely back on track. Not all of them. Some of them were permanently damaged, but we're not really seeing that so much at the super fund level, because the assets that the super funds own are those that you would expect to be more resilient to that kind of assault, if you like. But the smaller assets, many of those will simply never recover. And so not only did we have that absence of people creating a hole in the net operating income of these assets, but we also had a structural shift in the way that people shop, and the way that in retail outlets, and the way that people work in offices, and those two sub-asset classes in particular. And we've had a structural shift in both of those that has meant that some of those assets will simply not survive, and some of those kind of geolocations won't survive, whereas others will thrive. And so you take offices, for example, and we, there's still the pre-committed supply that's still coming through to some of our main CBDs, and that will create some excess supply. And at the same time, work from home, WFH, and the whole concept wrapped around that is pushing people away from the CBDs and into either satellite centers or literally working from home. And so there is likely to be some kind of hugely significant impact on vacancy rates in CBDs for that reason. That sort of twin reasons that have their nexus in COVID, right? The enforced working from home. And the additional supply that was already pre-committed before COVID started will have, in some areas in the world, a cataclysmic effect on vacancies, and some areas a very significant effect on vacancies. And of course, Property 101, where we have, and that's just basically Economics 101, we have a mismatch of demand and supply. The price responds, and so of course, if you've got an excess or an increase in vacancy, you have a decrease in price correspondingly. Not necessarily linear, because there are other factors involved, but there is a definite relationship between the two. And so that, in theory, will trigger a value reduction in those types of assets, and retail assets are the same for the same reasons, well, similar reasons. And in theory, that should spark a structural reversion to mean, if you like, or a reduction in those values for those sorts of assets, which arguably have run too hot over the last while. And so if we throw our mind back, my first recession and property recession, if you like, forget about economics, but property level recession was the aftermath of 1987. And then we've had it a couple of times since. So this will be my fourth. And in each time, for each time there was different triggers, but a run up in property values leading into some sort of trigger event, with different responses each time and different mechanisms. But the overall outcome was very similar, where you see charts that are rising, steep fall, rising, steep fall, and again, and it should happen again. And there will be some natural response mechanism over time that reverts to an upward curve. And we've seen all sorts of different metrics this time around that suggest strongly that we've had that big run up. And one of them, for example, is the tightening of capitalization rates in the commercial markets, right? Unprecedented now, even tighter than they were in pre-GFC, in the most recent one, post, sort of call it 2008-9, and even in any of those three, where we had, for example, negative risk premium, where the capitalization rate was below the risk-free rate, which then the only outcome, or the only expected outcome of that, was capital growth to make up for basically a negative income on a risk-adjusted basis, just crazy, right? And that didn't happen, and so that was that created a crater in values. But that aside, this time around, we're seeing some crazy cap rates that were below even then. The difference, of course, is that then interest rates are much higher than they are now. They're ridiculous. Well, I'd say ridiculous. They are generationally low, unprecedented interest rates. And so with low cap rates, we still have a positive risk premium. But with an increase in interest rates, we're also likely to see that premium maintained. And so a softening of cap rates, which will coincide with this structural shift in the way that retail and office property in particular are placed right now to almost inevitably see some negative reversion in values. And of course, like I mentioned, that will create some particular tension to those assets that are secured with debt finance, and we will see most likely some triggers of or breaches of interest coverage ratios and loan to valuation ratios, and then it'll be up to the banks to respond to those as they choose. But they are very definitely the masters of that scenario, and I've as a fund manager, have been through that scenario myself with one of the four majors. It was a welcome to the job. About a week after I started, one of my assets in one of my funds triggered an LVR and an ICR interest coverage ratio breach, which is pretty significant as a result of a fire in the anchor and the sub-anchor. And it went to what was called then bad bank. And I spent 2 years trying to get this out of bad bank, which was a very, very unpleasant place to be. And the bank, the meetings were terse, and the oversight was Big Brother-like, and the freedom was to operate an asset as you chose was extremely limited, and had every single counterparty you could possibly imagine crawling all over me or trying to secure their interests, be it the insurers or the council or the investors or the banks, or there's about 9 different counterparties all wanting their pound of flesh. And so that was a particularly difficult time, but that's not the point. The point is that the rule book has been rewritten, and it's reminded us of that relationship between people and property, and it's one that is best not forgotten, because strange things can happen. And it behooves us to bear that in mind and kind of learn and move through our careers. That nexus is paramount, and that probably kind of leads. Oh, actually, before I move on, inflation. You mentioned, Garrick. So the impact of inflation. We've seen the first of it, right? Is the increase in interest rates, which, as I mentioned, will flow through to capitalization rates, into valuations and into discounted cash flows, and that's kind of the primary impact. It will also increase rents for those rents that are triggered by a CPI review clause. The problem there is the capacity of a tenant to pay rent, which is kind of impaired a little bit at the moment for some industries, and so that might create some tension there, because it's all well and good having an inflation-related rental review, but if the tenant can't pay that increased rent, well, there's not much point in having it, and so either that tenant needs to be ejected and a new one found, or a deal needs to be made, as was the case in COVID, right, where there was a lot of forgiveness and a lot of postponement of rent. But also building costs, a particularly curly one at the moment. The nature of construction contracts will change as a result, and construction contractors are now much less likely to wear the risk of cost increases. So you might be familiar with a couple of big profile construction company, I won't say collapses, but both have moved into administration. ProBuild probably being the poster child at the moment. And they were bought out by one project in particular, where they were not, they were wearing the risk of cost increases, and their margins are typically razor thin anyway, and it ate too far into their margins and basically pushed them under, and so. But the impact, more particularly on valuers, is something that I want to touch on a little bit later on, if that's okay. And that is in the fundamental importance and the underappreciation of replacement cost assessments. So remind me, and we'll come back to that. But also there are refurbishment costs, right? In a DCF, if you're running it over 10 years, you will have some, or should have some, allowance for refurbishment of an asset, right? Because real estate simply is not a set and forget asset. It will always need capital expenditure to maintain its visual appeal, its functional appeal, and general aesthetics, right? And so if you leave an asset, then the response will be simply that tenants won't want to come back because it doesn't have end of trip facilities, or it doesn't have neighbors rated energy systems, or it doesn't have shaded windows, or preventing solar gain, or any number of things, right? And so, those things are important to assume, but of course, to make that assumption now will imply that refurbishment costs are higher than they might have been had one been assuming them 3 years ago. Just on that rental increase as well, there are 3 or 4 typical rental increase mechanisms, and inflation is just one of them. But there's market, and there's fixed, and then there's hybrid. And the hybrid is a mix of the other 3, and typically a mix of CPI and fixed, right? So it might be CPI plus a bit. So those are your 4 typical ones. And just on as an aside, with CPI inflation, there isn't one inflation number. There are quite a number of inflation numbers. So if you're reviewing a lease, it pays to be specific about which CPI number, whether it's average of the 8 capital cities, whether it's or the one specifically related to the city in which the asset is situated. So anyway, that's the opening stanza. I'll shut up now and over to you, Gary.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Mark. And I think you've really set the current context. And one way or another, it does seem that we're living through a real life experiment or case study or something, in the COVID world. Well, what you're saying about it rewriting the rule book, I think rings so true. And it sort of leads us back to just the way we look at changes, because I think a couple of things that you are looking at, is this a reversion to some long-term mean, or is it a fundamental way of using property? Things like the work from home, does that mean that there'll ever be the same demand, say, for office space that there was? And really, since the internet came on the scene, and you'll remember, there was a lot of gloomy sort of commentary on the end of retailing as we know it, and retail centres were going to be overtaken by eBay and so on. Now, we've got the whole, the conceptual frameworks that we use to understand change, and I'm just thinking of the whole notion of the unexpected and the rare compared to the predictable, and the terminology we often use for that is black swan events and so on. And I was just wondering how you see the valuer's opinion within this particular, current event of change. Is COVID really a black swan event, or is it something that's telling us something about how we move forward. So how would you see it from a practitioner's point of view?
Yeah, so, and that's a really good one. My view is that it was a grey swan event, right? So black swan, completely unpredictable, white swan, completely predictable, and grey swan sort of in the middle somewhere. And I believe grey swan for COVID because we've had tester versions of what we understand COVID-19 now to be any number of times, right? And you can go back to movies that were from the 1990s that were describing exactly pretty much what happened, right? Some big profile movies, right? And so but also we had SARS and we had swine flu and bird flu and all that stuff, right? And they were just sort of small tasters of what COVID-19 ended up being. And so anybody who sort of extrapolated that concept should have been able to see. Easy to say in hindsight, and I'm not Nostradamus, and so, but that's why I'm saying my view is that it was a grey swan because we've had tasters of this before, and this simply that this was on a different scale, and it was an unprecedented scale, and maybe the scale of the response was certainly not something that very many people had thought through. But yeah, it was somewhat predictable. In my view, it certainly was not a black swan event. And you mentioned something before as well about reversion to mean or structurally new, and I think it's kind of both, right? Yes, there is. This is a new operating environment with a new set of paradigms and the rules have been changed fundamentally and structurally, so the fact that it's creating a bit of a reversion to mean I think the mean has changed now, and the relationship, the interrelationship between the different asset classes has changed now. And I'll give you an example, right? So when I started in real estate about 1,050 years ago, property was largely industrial, office and retail, and that was kind of it. And now we have all of these alternatives, right? We have childcare, we have aged care, we have student accommodation, we have even prisons and multifamily in the US that we don't really have here. We've got build to rent that's sort of starting a fledgling industry, but more than that, just taking the big three, right? The relationship between those three has changed fundamentally as well, right? So retail was always the sharpest cap rate, office was in the middle, and industrial was in my early years always missed at 10%, right? It no matter what you did, industrial carried a yield or cap rate, depending which way you look at it, of 10%. Now there are assets on the books of some of these super funds that I mentioned before that are being valued on cap rates of 3.75. That was completely unthinkable 30 years ago, that there wasn't any way that was even conceivably possible. Yet here we go, here we have it. And those assets are the sharpest cap rates on the books, right? These guys have some of the best industrial, some of the best retail, and some of the best office assets in the country. And nothing is priced as sharply as these industrial assets, which completely flips on its head the paradigm that had operated forever, that retail was and should always be the sharpest priced asset, and so it is another lesson that nothing will always be as it always has been. Necessarily, I sound like Dumbledore. I don't mean to be, but you can't really. The message is you can't really take anything for absolutely granted, and it's another expression of what COVID has manifested invested in the real estate markets. And part of the reason for I'll call it a re-rating, it's seismically more than just a re-rating, but call it a re-rating of the industrial subsector. It has kind of taken over a lot of the function of the retail market. Because, as I'm sure your students have read, retail is now, move and as a result of COVID has accelerated the move to online retail. We now operate significantly more sophisticated logistics systems and warehousing systems, and that's much more important than it ever was. There wouldn't be very many people now who haven't ordered something online and haven't had it delivered home, whether it's a refrigerator, whether it's a T-shirt, whatever it is, and all of that stuff doesn't appear magically out of nowhere. It's stored, and it's shipped in and it's stored somewhere and it's delivered from somewhere, right? And so, these industrial assets, setting aside the mind-bogglingly disregard for the relative barriers to entry between retail and industrial. Industrial has now taken over a lot of that retail function. And by barrier to entry, of course, I mean, for those not familiar with the term, in order to assemble and build and have operational a shopping center of any substance, let's call it a sub-regional, it might take 5 years from inception to the local minister cutting the ribbon, between the planning, going through all of the objections, could be much longer, all of the objections, and then the construction phase, and office buildings going up, the same thing, right? 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, whatever, right, between inception and there you go, it's topped out and somebody's ready to move into the top floor. Whereas for an industrial building, it's a slab of concrete and some walls and a roof and some systems inside. It's a totally different concept, right? It can be done and dusted in a year. So that those are, and how much cheaper is it to build an industrial shed than to build a 55-story office building that Sydney's now getting? It's not even comparable. And so the barriers to entry are so low, but the cap rates ignore that completely and say, right, we now think, the market now thinks that these industrial assets, because of their relationship and the fact that they've just subsumed some of that function from those retail centers, is now the single most important asset and the best priced and the sharpest priced. And my concern would be that taken over the long term, to move from 10% to 4% is seismic and probably not sustainable, particularly in an increasing interest rate environment, and probably an overreaction. And I think those cap rates are quite vulnerable to some negative reversion over time. And I think it'll be the interest rates that kind of and a realization that the barriers to entry are so much lower. With all due respect to our good friends at Goodman and the brilliant job they do in delivering a lot of this stuff, they've ridden the wave of the industrial, call it an industrial revolution if you like, but a completely different type. But I just see in my little crystal ball a reasonable reversion. I don't think sub 4% for industrial, no matter how prime, is sustainable in the long run, particularly in a rising interest rate environment. So I don't know, did I kind of in that ramble answer your question, Garrick? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, you really did, and I think you also added an extra dimension to it, and I think that to focus on the way property is being done and used is really important. I mean, we've seen basically the invention of the business park and the way that a lot of retailing is done in previous industrial areas, and our industrial areas are now increasingly logistics when they're doing industrial type things. a relatively seldom genuine industry, and a lot of it is bulky goods retailing. Not to mention decentralisation of what is genuinely office staff. And I'm seeing that across Sydney. You'd see it in Brisbane and other places that you're working in. And that sort of then raises questions as to how different these, land uses are. And I think this, very good points. No, thank you for that. Now, where does that leave the poor old valuer in all that? Because we seem to have a very dynamic environment. It's certainly been propelled along with COVID, but I think a lot of those changes, I think you're pointing out, were changing beforehand. That rebadging of how land is using, that was pre-COVID. And to a certain extent, I think the financial environment has been changing. Now, again, I think it's important as a property person to be looking over the longer term, both in history and also into the future. We're looking at, everyone's talking about it, well, basically almost historically low interest rates. We're in a very low interest rate environment that has done all sorts of things to the markets, which I'll be interested in your observations on. But the fact that they are unusually low interest rates means that when they come back to the norm, whatever that is, that's going to be hitting hard too. And the poor old valuers caught in the middle there. The banks like to use valuers in a particular way, and I'd appreciate your view of the bank's relationship with property and their impact, and where the valuers kind of caught up in the middle of all that.
So the word scapegoat comes to mind. Yeah, absolutely. So it's a sad reality. No, I'll rephrase that. It's a sad observation of mine that opinions, because at the end of the day, a valuer is an interpreter of market opinion, and a soothsayer or a prognosticator or a forecaster of what the market will interpret its cycles, and both macro and micro, and distill those and manifest those into a particular asset, right? And so the valuer's job is to interpret those on behalf of the market and indicate an opinion of what a particular piece of real estate is worth at a particular time. Those opinions are being homogenized, and that's my sad observation, by a couple of things, and really just one thing expressed in two different ways, and that is risk. And that's exactly what you're talking to here, and that is valuers' opinions, and this kind of loops back, I guess, to the grey swan thing with COVID, and any number of other things, right? And so that there's a real paradox in valuation, that a valuer, who is required to forecast into the future in order to derive an opinion of value. So there are a couple of paradoxes. One is that a valuer is expected to look in the rearview mirror and assimilate from sales evidence in the past, and then take that and forecast it into the future, right? And arrive at a value of now. And so that's one paradox that there's no getting around that, really, in the way that we do things now. But either whether it's a cap rate derived valuation or whether it's a discounted cash flow valuation, it still affects a discounted cash flow forecast. And the homogenization, I think that's the adjective, is around the risk, right? So a valuer might be particularly gifted in forecasting the future and assimilating all of this macro and micro information, and think, right, I can foresee that in 3 years' time, as a result of what's going on now, that there is going to be some sort of significant negative event, which will make the value go down, or conversely, I think there's some significant event that's going to make the value go up. And so my true opinion as a valuer might be, that the valuation might actually be here or here, but not where one would expect it to be on kind of a homogenized, smoothed approach. And unfortunately, the risk and compliance people in the professional valuation firms, who are themselves driven by the professional indemnity requirements of their policies, which is those two same risks manifested in one, will simply typically not permit that out of range valuation, which might be the true expression of the valuer's opinion, but they will often simply be kind of boxed back into shape, saying, okay, you can't have that opinion because there is no absolute evidence to indicate that. And our professional indemnity is on the line, because if you value it too high, then the debt that is taken on that asset is too much, and then suddenly it gets valued again by somebody else, or something happens, and there's a negative reversion, and there's a breach, and then the bank and or your client is after your PI, professional indemnity, and there's some sort of claim, and there's a settlement, or there's a case, or whatever. Either way, it's damaging to reputation, and it's costly, and your PI premium will go up next time. Therefore, you do not have that opportunity as a valuer to express your true opinion. It needs to be homogenized into some sort of expected outcome, and that's it's a shame, because that valuer might actually be absolutely right, that the value might have done this, or the value might have done that, but didn't get the opportunity to express it simply because of those constraints. And so that's it just is what it is, right? That there isn't really in this environment, and it's only getting worse. So the PI is only getting more difficult, and to obtain, and getting more expensive, because of these risks that insurers see. And insurance is a business in and of itself. It needs to be profitable, and it needs to generate profits where it can, right? So yes, it's a competitive environment, but we've seen some insurers move out of Australia because, and it's kind of all linked back to climate change, which is another point we could maybe talk about if we get time. Climate change and climate type events that Australia is incurring. Those insurance companies are seeing all of this stuff and thinking, no, this is too hard. We want to leave the Australian market, and that's leaving fewer and fewer players in that space, which means that we're getting fewer and fewer options. And of course, economics 101 again. So the supply goes down, the demand is well, it's not really changing, but therefore the price is the response mechanism, and it goes up. And I'm seeing that myself, and most professional services firms are seeing the same thing. And so that's kind of the sad reality. No, sad observation.
No, thanks very much. It's really in amongst all that, the valuers have almost a conservative role, or they're being forced into a corner of having to take that view, which I think is what you're talking about with the homogenization. And it's interesting what you're saying about the risk and compliance issues, because it seems that juggling risk, I mean, in a sense, we're one of the many players sort of doing some sort of a ballet through the Cap M kind of line, in that we've got the banks on one hand you've got the users of property and businesses, and then you've got the valuers, and we're all kind of doing this juggle between risk and return. Now, I'd be interested in your thoughts about the position of the banks in all of this, because the banks kind of come in a number of ways, and they're supplying credit into the property market, which has a big effect on value, especially in the longer term. But also they're relying on their panel valuers to basically underwrite their risk. And in amongst all that, the valuers are trying to get business, so they're not always able to charge the fees that they'd like. So
yeah, quite right. Yeah, absolutely. And so, the banks are the enablers of, or have a big piece of the responsibility for the significant increase in the aggregate value of the broader market, residential and non-residential. Right? Had they not been lending, then demand would have been on a completely different scale, and we wouldn't have seen what we've seen. This build-up in value, and it's their business, right? They're in the business of lending money, and they've been particularly effective in doing that, and like I say, have been enablers of this rise in value. But in terms of valuation firms, it's kind of been a race to the bottom for fees, because, and particularly in the residential space, because technology has virtually taken over that business. And so, I started, my very first job was as a residential valuer, and I would get in the car and drive and inspect, walk through with a screwdriver, with a tape measure, and would physically inspect each and every asset that I valued. And that was a requirement for a mortgage valuation back then. And sign off it and all that sort of stuff, and I'd be able to do and then come back and write the report right on an MS-DOS computer that shows you how old I am, and I expect not very many of your people of your students would even know what that means. But if you look at an old movie and you see a black screen with green characters, that's what that means. And in fact, my first sales comparables system was on microfiche. And again, I expect that very few would even have any concept of what that was like. And there's no point describing it to you, because that is a system that is simply died with the dinosaurs. And so point is that system has now been taken over by technology, and a valuer now basically uses one of these things. And a lot of what is required is pre-programmed into that thing, pre-populated, and be lucky if the valuer slows down to second gear as you kind of pass that property, and all the sales evidence is kind of synthesized and pre-prepared. And whilst I could do maybe at a stretch 2 residential valuations a day when I started, now you could do multiples of that, and you're required to. It's become a lot more process and a lot less reliant on individual interpretation and skill. And it's partly as a result of that introduction of technology, and it's kind of brought it to a lot more firms. The fee structures have collapsed completely, right? So even way back when, the fees were bigger back in the late 80s when I started than they are now, right? You would think the opposite, but no, it's cheaper to get a residential valuation now by a factor of quite a lot than it was back then. And so, there's some pretty intense competition between valuation firms. And that has just, simply the supply and demand again. The price has responded, and fees are now significantly lower than they used to be, and barely reflective of the risk that valuers take. And one of those things that I was going to touch on in terms of risks that are not really even acknowledged And that is, in my role, I don't do valuations anymore, but I come across quite a few of them in various things that I do. And one of the elements of a commercial or residential valuation that is, I'd probably say, alarming. I myself wasn't aware of this until I was a fund manager, and it became relevant. And that's the replacement cost valuation, right? And so often in an instruction, a valuer is required to provide a replacement cost, and that typically, from my memory of it as a valuer, was largely regarded as the easiest part of a valuation, because you would simply take a floor area and take Rawlinson's. I don't even know if Rawlinson's still exists. A cost per square meter rebuild reference and multiply them, and that's your answer, right? Because land's not relevant, because land doesn't get destroyed in insurance replacement cost considerations, right? There are no assumptions that land is destroyed. Contamination is a totally different thing, right? And maybe that's an ESG topic we can touch on if we've got time. But the problem is that once you start digging into what insurance actually is, and I mentioned a while ago that in my first job I had that fire in one of my properties in one of my funds, in the anchor and the sub anchor, and I had truly had no idea the impact that would have on all sorts of things, right? And I have to give you this one example. It's one of my favorite stories. There's a thing called a main switchboard, right? That manages the power supply to a significant property like a shopping center, right? And it needs to have one for all sorts of reasons. Just take that as given. It has a main switchboard, and the main switchboard in this particular property was adequate. It did the job, and it serviced all of these tenancies. But the fire was so hot that it actually we couldn't get rid of the smell, and it was the smell actually. It wasn't the fire. It wasn't the smoke. It wasn't the water. It was the smell. It burned so hot because the sub anchor was a butcher, and it had sandwich panel, cool room kind of polystyrene type insulation, and this created an additional heat to your regular fire. And it was the heat, this incredible heat that fused with the concrete at a cellular level, that made the smell permanent, which meant that we had to dig out 2 feet of concrete in the floor and get rid of the concrete walls. And this rebuild took about 1.5 years, a bit longer, and just to rebuild part of a shopping center. It was incredible. Anyway, that's not really the point. The main switchboard, because this heat destroyed the cabling, the new cabling wouldn't fit into the old switchboard, which meant that the switchboard, which was perfectly serviceable for the old center, had to be replaced. There was no option. And this switchboard cost $750,000. And so I give that example because it's just one example where if you just take a gross floor area and multiply it by some cost per square meter out of some reference, you'll get a number that could be completely unrelated to the actual cost of replacing that building by a factor of 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And for reasons like that one, the $750,000 just for a switchboard, just because the cables wouldn't. There was nothing wrong with the main switch; it wasn't touched by the fire, but just because it was no longer compliant, it had to be replaced. So in a valuation, that was simply not recognized. And so, I implore your students to take much greater care and learn and understand what that insurance replacement cost and often it's just like a paragraph this big, a subheading and some words and a number, and that's it. And it's given about as much care and attention as that. But I implore your students to please go out and research and learn about this particular industry. And if we had time, I could. It's a half-hour lesson in all of these things and all of these incredible acronyms that they use, and all of these sublimits and all that sort of stuff that go into what an insurance policy, a commercial insurance policy actually is. And there is literally a list of about 30 things that need to be considered, not just some sort of reference and one multiplication. So I just wanted to make sure that your students understood what that sum insured actually is. And I need to say as well, another reason why that is so important is not only because the insurance company might say, okay, well, you insured it for this, so we're not going to replace your main switchboard. In the end, I was lucky and they did. But there's a thing called co-insurance, right? And it's a really important term for those of your students who want to become commercial valuers. And that is basically the concept that if you underinsure, then the insurance company will only pay out a proportion of your sum insured by relative to the amount by which you are underinsured. And so if you're underinsured by 50%, then you will only get 50% of what your sum insured is, let alone forget about what it costs to rebuild. And you could be, your client could be out of pocket. If we're talking about a big building, then it's millions or tens of millions of dollars that isn't covered. Please take care of that sum insured calculation. So back to the banks. Yes, scapegoat, and yes, that they are a kind of a toy of convenience for valuers. And yes, they operate panels, and it's really important for a valuer to be on a panel, because if you're not on the panel for the bank, then you don't get a look in. Right, it's only those valuers who are approved on their panel who get the valuation work through the banks, and banks are a significant source of work for both residential and non-residential valuation. And so that is a matter of relationships and a matter of demonstration of knowledge and a demonstration of risk and compliance awareness. And a demonstration of capacity, which will also include redundancy, right? So if Mary is away, then Bob can do the job, right? So the panels are really important, and also part of that, I mentioned the race to the bottom for fees, and there's a mechanism that the banks use where I don't know, your students might be more familiar with Airtasker than Microfiche, right? And the banks use a similar system to Airtasker where valuers actually bid for work, including the price that they're prepared to do it for. Basically the same as Airtasker, and that has contributed to that race to the bottom for fees, because they're all competing with each other and they don't know what the other firm is offering, and so they have to basically pitch it as so it's basically a tendering system, right? But a high frequency tendering system, and it's all automated, and so it's not as lucrative. And not as well regarded, I think, as it used to be. I don't mean to sound like a mean boy and hating on the valuation industry, because it's a pivotal role in the functioning of the markets, right? Because somebody has to do it. There has to be a third-party independent assessor of value in order for the banks to work, right? But the banks. And I don't mean to be hating on the banks either, because they do what they do and they do a great job. But the system now is such that there's not a great. I don't want to use the word respect. Not a great. I've used it before. I use the word nexus again between the two. that is kind of fair all round. I think it's a bit rough on the valuers. So anyway.
No, I think you're making an excellent point with that. And it is a place where the whole concept of being a professional is being sort of challenged, because in a sense, a professional is somebody who the community has to trust. And when they start competing for fees, that black box of trust, trust me, I'm a valuer. And it also applies to engineers, architecture, land surveying. I know in structural engineering, who knows how much steel you really need in your foundations or your structure. But if structural engineers start competing for fees, and they do, I have, the easiest way to be safe as a structural engineer is just to put more steel in. The builder never knows that his building is costing him an awful lot more money, but the structural engineer charges him hardly any. And I think the same thing is happening with valuation. I think you're making an excellent point with that. I'm just a bit conscious of time. I don't want to keep you too long, because I know that you've got other obligations. Perhaps what we might do, and I'm just very tempted to get you back for another conversation, but we might sort of talk about that offline. But you've mentioned ESG a number of times, and it'd be interesting. Maybe we might just finish on that as a topic, because in a sense there's a certain parallel, I think, with the COVID changes. But I'd just be interested in your thoughts of that, and then we might finish up, and because it still seems to be a lot to talk about.
So ESG is a rapidly evolving area of endeavor for the real estate industry. It's fingers are being pointed at it as being a primary contributor to carbon, and both in the construction and its operation, and more particularly in its operation. But certainly in design, there is a focus on now carbon capture and all that sort of stuff, and recycling materials, and also on life cycle style analysis, and that's a whole big concept of an approach to building design that enables basically recycling on a huge scale. But ESG, sort of boiling it down to the asset by asset level, is a really important one, and it's something that's being driven by investors, and there's also a massive regulatory wave coming. Right, it's being developed in Europe in particular. And we're seeing now the first kind of licks of that regulation starting to filter through here. But there is, it's kind of like a tsunami, right? And the tide is kind of leaving the shoreline now. And in typical tsunami fashion, and it's going to come back as the biggest wave, and it will likely be one of the biggest issues in real estate, starting in the next year or two, and it will compound, and it will become a huge issue. And my observation is that the real estate industry is simply not ready for it. So we've had neighbours for the longest time, right? And it simply measures basically energy efficiency, right? And similar with water, right? Water efficiency, and that is literally the tip of the iceberg. So over time, we are likely to have to develop mechanisms that measure much better than we do now, because we're basically in kindergarten now in our approach to the measurement and application of ESG technology and understanding. And by ESG, for those not familiar with it, environmental, social, and governance are the three words that comprise that acronym. and it's really primarily focused on the E, the environment, and carbon capture and all that sort of stuff. Social, yes, and governance, yes, but they're a lot. They're slightly nebulous concept, but they're kind of not as hard to measure and not as hard to deal with. But the E is the one that is, you know, it's that tsunami coming, and you know, it's an area that you know, some of your students might take an interest in and contribute to the development of, because there is a lot of work to be done in that space, and you know, real estate really is kind of behind the eight ball a little bit, and it's and part of the reason for that is so difficult. You know, in equities, it's a lot easier, right? You can have ESG filters if you're a fund manager in the equities market. You can have your filters set to, yeah, okay, I don't want anything exposed to tobacco. I don't want anything exposed to cutting down trees. I don't want anything exposed to guns or violence. I don't want anything exposed to, you know, any number of other antisocial, what is considered antisocial behaviors, or you know, and that's easy, right? You just chop out American tobacco, you chop out BP and Caltex and blah blah blah, right? Easy, done. But in the real estate industry, it's totally different. To try and capture and measure and understand and apply all of those coming rules. So we don't even know what the rules are yet. So, you know, we're kind of developing a system that we're going to be ready for this onslaught of right, you have to do this, you have to do this, buildings have to do this, they're not allowed to do that, and this sort of stuff. And so we've seen it a little bit in government, right? Federal government has, for, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so, had a mandate that they would simply not occupy any asset, typically office asset, that had less than a 4-star neighbours rating, right? And so I had in Canberra, I had an office building in one of my funds that was a 4-star office building, and you know, some of the lease terms around that were really tight, and one that basically the bottom line was, if it dropped below 4 stars, they were moving out, and they could move out at a moment's notice with no penalties, nothing, right? And so the pressure to keep it at 4 stars was huge, because they were the only tenant of the building, and so, you know, didn't have a choice. It had to be 4 stars, and it was reevaluated every year based on operating metrics and usage metrics. And so, you know, as an insurance policy, I would buy, at that time, I would buy green power to boost the neighbour's rating, which is basically kind of sustainably sourced electricity from solar or turbine or whatever. But that is now being outlawed, and it needs to be a pure rating. But often in leases, you'll find that it can't be supplemented by green power, and so there's a lot of pressure. So for those of you, have I dropped out? I'm not sure. For those of you who are, you know, in the funds management industry or going into that funds management industry, it's certainly one to watch, right? The whole green rating and how it's incorporated into a lease is really something to be aware of, because it can be a trigger to losing a tenant at a moment's notice if a neighbour's rating doesn't measure up.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and it's almost the politics of the environment that we're being hit with in the property industry. So we have to service this. No, thank you very much for that. What I might do, I'll just to conclude, I'd be interested. I mean, we've been talking really from the perspective of the funds manager in much of our discussion, and maybe you could just conclude by maybe just some concluding comments on life as a funds manager. What skills are needed? how a valuation background contributes to effectiveness of funds management, and to a certain extent what the rewards are from operating in that part of the industry.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. Look, it is. Sometimes I describe it as the ultimate expression of real estate skill and experience, because for the reason, with all due respect to all of the other professions associated with it, funds management is it's not really a profession because it doesn't have a professional body, but it's a role in the property ecosystem that incorporates all of the others pretty much. And so, I like to use the analogy where a funds manager needs to be able to speak the language of a valuer, the language of a lawyer, the language of a town planner, the language of an engineer, the language of a construction contractor, on and on and on, right? Everybody else, insurers, council, investors, everybody else is all the other counterparties, and the funds manager is kind of the one in the middle that needs to interpret and speak everybody's language. So valuers have their own language, and engineers have their language, and lawyers have their language, and they just express themselves in those languages, and that's kind of the end of the story. And a funds manager needs to be able to speak all of those languages and understand them and interpret them, and then the obligation is to take all of that learned knowledge and apply it in such a way as to try and generate the best outcome for that fund or the asset inside that fund. Sometimes it's a particularly difficult job. Sometimes it's an especially rewarding job, and so it's not something that can be done effectively without a fair bit of experience and having been exposed to different professions and what those different professions mean, and exposed to a few kind of tough events that sort of give the true appreciation. Is one thing for me to say, look, I went through a fire, but blah, blah, blah. But it's another thing to actually go through and understand the importance of some of these events and in that kind of broader ecosystem and the sorts of manifestations that they can bring. Right? It's one thing to hear about. It's another thing to experience it. So, expect to learn on the job. And valuation is a fantastic springboard into funds management, in my opinion, but it's not the only one, because as a valuer, it's basically a requirement to understand the interrelationships between different markets, and to understand those participants in the market and sort of anticipate what they think, how they will react to things, how to interpret sales evidence, and also the technical analysis is also really important. And so, for example, for what it's worth, I've seen a few funds management models, right? It's an essential element, and almost exclusive. I've never seen one that isn't built in Excel, right? And so I've gone and built one myself because I've seen some that are not particularly effective in my view. And so I've kind of taken that accumulated wisdom and sort of built one myself. But the point of that is that that technical analysis that comes from valuation is really important, and all of these things interrelate. Whether it's insurance, whether it's OPEX, whether it's CAPEX, whether it's lease renewals or reviews, or the scenario analysis of a new property into an existing fund, and especially debt and the covenants that come with holding debt, and reporting and blah blah blah. Right? It goes on and on and on, and it's all interrelated. So it's a broad ranging, fascinating role that I would encourage anybody who has an interest in sort of bringing all of those different pieces together to explore. because it does have a lot of benefits to it, and it can be quite complex. It can be quite frustrating, but it is also quite rewarding. And there are also some other courses that focus specifically on funds management that supplement the great stuff that I'm sure all your students are learning from you, Garrick, and your team.
Oh, thank you very much, Mark. I think we're probably just about out of time, but I think we could probably continue to talk for a fair bit longer, but we might just leave it there.
That's right.
Thank you very much, and really appreciate time. It's absolutely fascinating talking to you, and I look forward to being able to maybe sort of chat some more in the time. So thank you.
That would be my pleasure. Thank you, Gary.
Great. Thank you very much.